Good afternoon, and welcome to today's talk, Land Grab U, Land Grant Universities and Indigenous Peoples. This event is part of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center's ongoing public events series, Living Democracy. The series, which will continue through May, explores the conditions under which democracy can flourish, the forces that imperil it, and the political, social, and cultural interventions needed for democracy to realize its full potential as an inclusive, equitable, and just political system. I want to make sure our audience members are aware of the question and answer function on the screen. Since this is a webinar, we do not have the ability to have the audience interact directly with our speakers, but you can submit your questions in English or Spanish at any time during the event, and our speakers will address them after their presentation. Also, this event will be recorded and available online in a few weeks. In the post-webinar survey, which I urge you to take, you can sign up for our mailing list to be notified when it becomes available. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. I want to extend our thanks to our Spanish interpreters for this event, Professors Viola Emilio and Alini Ferreira, as well as to the ASL interpreter, Joe Malizia. Thanks go as well to the staff members of the IHC who coordinate our events. Associate Director Aaron Nerstad, Assistant Director Adam Morrison, and Senior Artist Paula Schaefer. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the IHC's research focus group, the American Indian and Indigenous Collective, AIIC. At the IHC, the AIIC has hosted conferences with the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation, the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, and the UCSB American Indian Student Organization. I want to thank the AIIC conveners, Candace Wade, Professor of English, and Margaret McMurtry, Graduate Student in Religious Studies, for proposing today's event, both because of the importance of the topic and also because it has opened a path for the IHC to explore ways in which we might develop further collaborations with the AIIC and local Chumash communities. I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, as well as to other Indigenous people present today. It is my great pleasure now to introduce our speakers, Tristan Ahtone and Robert Lee. Tristan Ahtone is a member of the Kiowa tribe and is editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer. He has reported for multiple news outlets, including the PBS NewsHour, National Native News, NPR, Al Jazeera America, and High Country News, where he served as Indigenous Affairs editor. His stories have won numerous honors and investigative awards, and in 2017, he was the recipient of a Harvard University Nieman Fellowship. Robert Lee is a lecturer in American history at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on Indigenous dispossession and U.S. state formation in the 19th century American West. He received his PhD from Berkeley, his MA in American Studies from the University of Heidelberg, and his BA in History and Economics from Columbia University. Before coming to Cambridge, he was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. It is my pleasure to welcome Tristan Ahtone and Robert Lee to the IHC.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk about the story. It's an honor to be sharing it with everybody. My partner Bobby and I will start from the beginning today and give you an overview of the story, as well as the practical use of the platforms that we've built around it. Can everybody see the screen okay? Good, cool. As a reminder, if you like, we're using the hashtag LandGrabU to help aggregate stories, thoughts, and hot takes on the subject. So we encourage you to use it if you're sharing on social media. But we're going to talk about the Morrill Act, how to use the data we collected, and how institutions have started engaging with this investigation. So here's essentially the breakdown. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the creation story that we're told is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land. But the truth is a lot more complicated. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. And in all, the act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land from more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. That land, when grouped together, represents an area approximately the size of Denmark. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states, making research and reporting on its impacts nearly impossible. Through our 2-year investigation, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels in order to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. And this story provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. Bobby?
Thanks, Tristan, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about the work that went into this this story and website and database that we produced. I'd like to start today by giving you some background on the project and provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach in this project. The indigenous sources of university land has been really a major emerging issue in about the past 5 years or so, with studies of slavery in the university providing a natural springboard into the topic. In 2014, for instance, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote a book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, where she flagged the issue. Cultural theorists like Kay Wayne Yang have discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. More recently, there's been important articles by Sharon Stein, who we quote in the article in High Country News, and Margaret Nash as well, who framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took land from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And they really started to unpack how this process worked. Meanwhile, there have been a few research projects at places like UMass, at places like Virginia Tech, that tried to map the Morrill Act footprint of their schools and connect them to indigenous nations, but they ran into some snags trying to put that together. There's also been some schools like the University of Iowa, for instance, Michigan State, the University of Nebraska, that have begun mapping their Morrill Act parcels, but they haven't been asking whose land, who originally owned this land, who its original caretakers were. And more work is currently on the way. Some of that work is being done at UC by graduate students, by faculty. There is a UC project that's trying to understand the geographic footprint of land-grant universities. There's activities going on at other universities. Down at SMU, there's an anthology in the works on campuses and colonialism that are really going to push things forward. The NASA journal, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association journal, this spring is going to be putting out an issue centered around land grab universities, and they've invited a number of scholars to explore the issue from a number of angles. Now, all this is to say that it's a really exciting time to be thinking about what was until recently an entirely neglected issue in the scholarship and in the public memory of land-grant universities. You see this in campus buildings. You see it in statues of Abraham Lincoln, in busts of Justin Morrill, the senator who proposed the legislation. You see it in the speech of Vice President Harris a couple of days ago, mentioning land-grant universities as a part of sort of democracy's promise in the United States. Now, the High Country News collaboration that started to look into the relationship between indigenous land and university endowments, the contribution that we were making to this sort of burgeoning field of research began in 2018, when Tristan and I were both on fellowships at Harvard. And it was a fortunate moment because I'm a historian, Tristan is a journalist, and we would otherwise be running really in different circles. And the project that we developed was the goal was to try and unspool the entire Morrill Act knot. not just to identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state, but to locate them all insofar as it was possible, and to track down the indigenous origins of every single parcel and gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really one of the key points here, that the Morrill Act wasn't a donation, it was a wealth transfer from indigenous nations to university endowments. And if we can go to the next, slide, Tristan. Sorry, back to the map there. This map here, which you find in the High Country News story, is the result of our investigation in its most condensed form. This map and the next couple of slides you're going to look at were all produced by Margaret Pierce, who was a cartographer on the project. But before I get into what you're looking at sort of here on this map, let me give you a quick sketch of the Morrill Act itself. Now, land grants for colleges or for universities began earlier than the 1860s. The earliest that I've seen is one for Jefferson College in Mississippi, which is now defunct, which was back in 1803. There were land grant colleges through the states, places like Michigan State University, Pennsylvania State University, that were established before the Morrill Act of 1862. What the Morrill Act of 1862 did was it nationalized this program. It created a system of land grant universities across the United States and the opportunity for new states, when they entered the Union, to become eligible to receive these same grants. It's issued at a moment in the Civil War in 1862, when where there are two other landmark land laws passed. You've probably heard of them: the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave parcels to individuals who were willing to live on and farmland 160 acres for 5 years. There's the Pacific Railway Act, which funded the Transcontinental Railway. That same year, there was the Morrill Act. It was actually the smallest of those sort of big three of 1862. And it gave away what amounted to 10.8 million acres of land across 24, mostly Western states. These grants went to 47 states, and these states would sell the land, they would lease the land, they would sell the scrip they received. They would funnel the endowments into universities, into 52 universities. There are a couple of states that divided the grant between a couple of different universities, so that's how you get to that number. These schools that are mostly public, places like the University of California, but some of them were private, places like Cornell, like MIT. And the land that was used for the grant came from, as Tristan mentioned earlier, roughly 250 tribes and nations. This land was claimed by the United States through 162 different treaties, ratified, unratified treaties, and various land takings, outright takings of land. In California, the land was simply seized. There was a series of unratified treaties. And when you look at how much was paid to acquire this land, to acquire indigenous land, it amounts to roughly $400,000, or nearly, so $400,000 was paid, and when you look at how much was raised, it's about $23 million. So it's about 57 to 1. That means for every dollar that's paid to acquire indigenous territory for the land that is funneled into the Morrill Act, $57 are raised for principal for the endowments of these universities. Now, in contemporary dollars, what we're talking about here is an endowment principal worth across the board roughly $500 million in today's money. And what you can see here on this map are those nearly 80,000 parcels spread across the 24 states. And a means to compare them here. There's some pull lines here where you see on the right the Chippewa Treaty of 1837, which contributed more than 1 million acres to 33 land grant universities and raised $3.2 million. It cost the US less than $65,000. In the middle there's Gage County, Nebraska, which was among the most densely covered counties in the United States with Morrill Act parcels. All of them came from the Kaw, or Kansas Nation. In California, the pullout on the left on the map This is the area that had the highest percentage of Morrill Act parcels within a single Indigenous land cession. It's near the site of the Mariposa War. So if you're in Santa Barbara there, I figure this is probably a few-hour drive away from you. And what our project allows you to do is actually to find those parcels, to visit them. Let me tell you a little bit more about how the Morrill Act worked. If we can go to the next slide. Basically, there were two ways that the land was distributed through the Morrill Act, and they separated between eastern and western states, roughly. On the right here, you have eastern states, and because eastern states like New York, like Virginia, didn't have public domain land, these states received something called scrip, basically coupons to select land anywhere on the surveyed public domain of the United States. So this is why you see Cornell's grant being spread across, I think, 16 or 17 different states in the West. This is where the scrip was located. Now, Western states, because there was the public domain overlapped with Western states like California, you see California, University of California here on the left, they received land. They got the right to choose parcels within their states, and they had to choose land within their states. So states like California, their grants would be entirely within the state of California. Oregon, the same thing. Idaho, the same thing. So this is the different footprint you see here. And by mapping all of these parcels and doing the work in the archives, paper and digital archives, we could develop a database where you could break this down statistically and understand it in terms of the numbers, to quantify this process. And these are these numbers that you see in red here. We use them to structure the story. You can find more of them on the website. If we could go to the next slide, we can take a closer look in. When you drill down, you can see these individual parcels. This is a graphic that Margaret Pierce made, and also with the help of Kaylin Goodluck, who was a photographer on the project. You can see a square mile parcel in Tucson in red, zoomed in over a satellite photo. Here you can see the actual bounds of it. You could put these into your GPS, you could drive to them, you could visit them. You can see what's there, and that's exactly what Kaylin, the photographer, did for the project. He visited many of these parcels and took all the pictures that are in the piece. Here is the red dot on this Tucson parcel, the Apache Tears Motel. Can we go to the next slide? And what we also do in the story is sort of give a rundown of sort of the step-by-step. This slide, you're not meant to read this slide. Let me just tell you what the sort of how the Morrill Act worked in general, how it goes from A to Z in terms of distributing this land. First, Congress makes these offers to the states to take part in the Morrill Act program. Some of the land that's going to be used is land that has already been acquired from Indigenous nations. Some of it's going to be acquired in the future. These grants are going to range in size from anywhere from 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres. And those sizes are going to depend on the size of the congressional delegation of each state, which is a proxy for population. So more populous states get larger grants. New York is the most populous state, has the largest congressional delegation in 1860. They use the census to apportion these. So it gets the largest grant, 990,000 acres, almost 1 million acres. There is this issue between the scrip that the eastern states get and the land that the western states get. And then they go on disposing this land. The states will select the land, or they'll sell off the scrip to others who can select the land, to speculators, things like that. Some universities will even set up real estate offices. This is exactly what the University of California does. For many years, they're running a real estate office out of the university. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tristan. He's going to explain a little bit about the website that we put together for the project.
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do with this project is make our data available to anybody who wanted to do additional reporting or research or to even fact check our findings. If you're not comfortable using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we wanted to make sure that you could still have access to the information in a clear and user-friendly way. So on landgrabu.org, you have access to the same data that we're using with the same level of accuracy. And you can explore all of it through interactive maps. So for instance, university pages like UC's here give you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received, but most importantly, you can play with the map that we've put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site and these maps, and what it allows you to do is see the connections between the institution and the land. You can also zoom in and get really, really detailed all the way down to the acre. You can fly through or even locate yourself on the map. Those crosshairs on the side there allow the website to locate you and find out if you live next to one of these parcels or even on one of these parcels, as our developer, Jeff McGee, found out during the reporting process. He lives on one of the parcels in Seattle. You also have an opportunity to check addresses. So that search function at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel or even what land cession it's in. There's really a ton of information here to play with and allows you to explore and construct sort of your own narratives. And you also have the option to play with links to click on state boundaries, university links, or even land cessions. Obviously, that information on land cessions is invaluable for a number of applications outside of this project. As well, you'll also see that in the case of UC and some other universities, a statement was provided when we asked for comment, and we've added those to the university pages as well. So for instance, if you zoom out on the map, you can see all the connections the university has to Morrill Act lands. And one of the coolest things that I think you can do for each of these parcels is click on them and go to a page just for that parcel. Essentially what Cody and Jeff have done is create thousands of pages for each of these land parcels so that you can get an incredible amount of information, acre by acre, state by state, university by university. So as you can see, when you zoom into a parcel in California, you can click and go to that parcel page. And when you click on it, it sort of looks like this. It's just a basic page for the parcel where you can see the treaty co-signers, when it was acquired by the United States, and the gains associated with it. Just with this page, you can start to construct a story about this very specific piece of land. But also because the site works on mobile, you can actually go there by locating yourself on your phone and going to that actual parcel, which, as Bobby mentioned, is how our photographer, Kaylin Goodluck, was able to do his work. And the parcel that I just showed you and the data that you see here in front of you is in Los Angeles. By actually going there and taking a look, we actually were able to figure out that the Directors Guild of America is built on that parcel. So Kaylin was able to go there, take pictures, and start essentially putting a face to the information. And it's really quite incredible when you're actually on the ground. For instance, these are private residences in LA. We know that it was seized by unratified treaty in 1851. It was granted to the state of California for the benefit of the University of California. We know that no money was paid for title because it was an unratified treaty. And we know that the university raised $786 on its sale. For instance, here's the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. Again, we know that the Duwamish and Suquamish ceded this land by treaty in 1855. It was granted to the state of South Carolina for the benefit of Clemson University and South Carolina State. $3.91 was paid. The universities raised $58.06. Despite signing a treaty, the Duwamish still do not have federal recognition, and that this is now a military cemetery. As well here, as you saw earlier, the splash page and the actual print piece. This is in Adams, Nebraska, Kaw Nation land ceded by treaty in 1825 for the Ohio State University. And then we have this scrapyard in El Rosa, Minnesota, which was ceded in 1851 for University of Minnesota. Really, again, there's an amazing amount of stuff that you can do when you get on the ground. And obviously, we only had a couple of weeks to send Kaylin out to do this work. So, you know, there's 80,000 parcels, and there's an opportunity to visit every single one of them in our data. Also, there's still a lot more work to be done. So this summer, we reported that at least 16 land-grant universities, nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres of Morrill Act land that brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue combined in fiscal year 2019 alone. The University of California was one of those schools. And also keep this in mind, we only collected data on fiscal year 19. The cumulative revenue from acquisition to present at these universities is completely unknown. It's open for you to report and localize. There's still just a ton that can be done here. And again, that data here and all of the stories data is available for you to download. And I'll let Bobby explain.
Yeah, I want to say a little bit more about Tristan's last point about the possibilities for more research. But before I get into that, I would say that the project as we constructed it, there were sort of three levels of what you consider sort of of data curation. There was the story that we put together for High Country News, where we examined the data and looked deeper into the histories of particular universities, connected them to Indigenous nations to be able to tell the story of the connection between the violent expropriation of Indigenous land and the emerging prosperity of land-grant universities. The website allows much more freedom than the story itself does to really explore the data for yourself, but in a user-friendly way. There are interactive maps. You can examine the pages, but you can really choose your own adventure through the massive data that we've collected. So the least curated level of data is the material that we posted on GitHub. This is the database itself that we built to write this story. And we've released it. It's all open source. There are the GIS polygons that we mapped that we created to map the parcels. There's all the attribute data that's associated with it, and this allows you to drill in even deeper. So this is designed for researchers, for journalists who want to dig deeper into the material and see what else they could pull out. Really, our vantage on this story was from sort of the level of 30,000 feet looking down. There's much more to find out, and we didn't want to have readers to have to reinvent the wheel here. So we put everything out on GitHub. You can download it today. And what you see here is this is the GitHub page. These are some of the files. We can go to the next one. There is a user guide for the database, how the files fit together, what they can contain in plain English. If you can use an Excel spreadsheet, you can explore practically all of our data. And if you can join files to look at census data, you can explore our GIS files. They're not complicated files. It's a large database, but it's not complicated to use, and it's explained in the user guide here. If you just go to the next slide, this is the main parcel spreadsheet. 80,000 rows of data. There's a lot more here, even than we were able to put on the website. There are links to the BLM. There are all sorts of dates about when this land was patented, who it was patented to. all for you to look in and dig deeper. So all of this material is there, and we encourage others to look at it, with classes, to look at it for research projects, to look at it for reporting. And some people have been doing that. And I'll turn it back over to Tristan to tell you a little bit about what people have been doing since we published the story.
Yeah, to Bobby's point, this choose your own adventure and this idea of an open source investigation has really led to a lot of interesting development. So essentially, the story has started a public conversation on the debts universities owe to Indigenous communities, and we expect those to continue long into the future. And especially despite COVID-19 really dominating news coverage and news cycles, you know, our report has really inspired dozens of op-eds, blogs, podcasts, local news items like this piece out of Scallywag magazine that took our data and then dug even deeper into University of North Carolina, as well as Vox Media building timelines for the connected history of the Osage people. Really just a ton of different stuff that's come out in terms of how folks are using it. You know, also we've seen a lot of movement at universities too. At the University of Florida, Yale University, and Cornell University, student governments and advocacy groups have demanded investigations, protested for racial justice, and petitioned for increased recruitment and funding for students from tribal nations disadvantaged by the Morrill Act. As well, advocates are using the data to push for free tuition for Native students and the return of land. Meanwhile, thousands of undergraduate and graduate students at scores of universities are reading the report in journalism, education, and liberal arts courses. We know the University of Missouri even made it required reading university-wide through its freshman composition program. At Cornell, the largest Morrill Act beneficiary, faculty launched a project to document the university's financial windfall. And similar internal reviews are ramping up at MIT and the University of Connecticut, which is developing an exhibition based on the data as part of a push for a new cultural center for Native and Indigenous students. And at Ohio State, researchers have partnered with the First Nations Development Institute to draft a reconciliation plan that will benefit the tribal communities whose land seeded the school's founding. As well, Washington State University has taken the lead in actually rewriting its land acknowledgments to incorporate the report's findings, as well as Texas A&M. And UW has pledged to commission a team to determine reconciliation plans, while also working groups at Colorado State, Arizona State, and the University of Minnesota, and others are likewise laying groundwork for reforms, tying their land grant legacies to the needs of their Indigenous students. So this is a brief overview of the project. And again, we're excited to be talking about it with you and happy to answer any questions regarding the work or any thoughts that you have on it.
Thank you very much. We do have many questions. I'm going to start us off with one. You mentioned, and maybe this is as a point of clarification, the various movements at the university, student government, advocacy groups, undergraduates and graduate students, faculty members. For example, at Ohio State University, the reconciliation plan, is that something that's being proposed to the administration, or are university administrations now taking up responses, embodied responses?
These are primarily proposed, and what we've primarily seen in the response to the story is administrations generally either ignoring the findings or saying that's in the past and we're moving forward and doing our best now. But what we're seeing is really ground up sort of grassroots organizing around this, which has been perhaps most fascinating about how this is being kind of bubbling up and pushing up. And obviously administrations are beginning to take this a lot more seriously and engage, but these are not administration led. These are student, staff, and faculty led.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just add about yeah, this really coming up from students, from faculty. The program at Ohio is brand new. This is we learned about it really only maybe in the past month or so. But they have set up a website that's available. I don't have the URL here, but if someone can grab it, maybe they can drop it into the chat. And it started, I believe, with a grant from the university. So there is some interest, maybe at least it's within some funding structures within the university to be able to start to look into this history more seriously.
So we have a number of questions just about access to the resources. So you've made it clear that all of these materials are available on your website, right? landgrabu.org. So
that's right. There's if you're looking for the data, it's on the main page. You slide down and there's a link to GitHub, and that will take you there.
Okay, and the slide deck also for our audience members will be available as soon as we post the video webinar. So all of this material will be available on the IHC website within a couple of weeks. So some questions now. Are there suggestions of how the injustice of stolen Indigenous lands might be remedied or beginning toward that goal? Again, you've covered some of this, but do you want to say more about the actual remedying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can start. Really, what those remedies look like, there's no one size fits all. I think every institution and every community is approaching this differently. So I do think that the common strains that we're sort of seeing in terms of the conversation have been, free tuition or tuition assistance to Indigenous students. I've seen a lot of forgiveness of debt to Indigenous students that have taken out student loans. I've also seen a lot of conversation about return of lands through whatever means are necessary. That's typically legislative action, but those are kind of the strains that I'm seeing here in return of land and tuition assistance or free tuition. But generally how these are being approached, they kind of take on the complexion of the university or the students or the tribes that are involved.
I think one of the most robust responses on this issue has come recently from students at Cornell University that petitioned their student government, and I think it's going up to the higher administration now with a series of demands. Some of them related to tuition, debt relief, others things like space for Indigenous students, recruitment. Also teaching elements, turning programs into departments, creating faculty lines for Indigenous studies, creating opportunities for students to study within reformed curriculum programs. That was one of the large issues there. So there is no singular solution to this. This is more than 50 different communities talking about how they can respond to this information.
Thank you. Could you speak about the absence of Puerto Rico, the University of Puerto Rico on the list, and also University of Hawaii? One of our audience members pointed out that on their website, it indicates that they were founded in 1907 under the Morrill Act as a land-grant college. So was there a reason you didn't include them, or?
Yeah, I can. So the way that we structured the study was really to center the land. We focused on the land. So we wanted to understand where was all of this land, who did it go to, who did it come from, and how did that benefit take shape? And one of the things that we discovered in this process is that the title of land grant university does not necessarily mean there was the reception of an actual land grant. In the case of the University of Hawaii, when it's grandfathered into the land grant system, it receives in a cash endowment from the federal government. This is the same with the territorial universities in Guam, in Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands. This is all the same situation. These are universities that receive their grants as cash in the second half of the 20th century. It's the same thing with tribal colleges, which were integrated into the land-grant university system in the 1990s. The land-grant university system starts out with the Morrill Act of 1862. There's also the Morrill Act of 1890, but really it becomes a sort of a community of universities that gain access to subsequent legislative actions that fund universities within the United States, that fund these land-grant universities. So this land is, for the most part, still not retained by these universities, although we found that 500,000 acres is retained by the states for the universities. This has been sold a long time ago. For the most part, in today's world, the income from these funds are not a significant part of the operating expenditures, although they were in the early days. It's sort of the seed money that starts the system. But where that seed money came from wasn't always land. So it wasn't land in the case of Hawaii. And we also excluded from the study, although we would encourage others to look into it, land-grant universities that have that status, but the land that they received came through, did not come through the Morrill Act of 1862, came from other sources. This is the case with Oklahoma State University, which is not on there, but is a land-grant university. This is the case with the University of Alaska, which is not on there, but also land-grant university that did receive land, but through a different system of laws.
And in fact, one of the other questions is whether you do have any plan to expand this work to pre-Morrill Act land-grant universities.
We would like to see that type of work done. And there are others who are talking about it. We have no active project at the moment to uncover these. If you look back through the slide deck there, the piece in Scallywag magazine was on University of North Carolina. And they were founded before the Morrill Act, and they received other sources of funding. This is also the case with that Jefferson College that I mentioned at the beginning. There are lots of these universities. There are lots of laws. The distribution of the public domain is a massive research area that involves thousands of laws over the course of more than a century. Many of these involve colleges and universities, and we're only just beginning to understand the implications of that. But there are people who are looking into this actively. The issue of NASA that I mentioned earlier in the talk, we'll have some discussion of this in regards to universities in Ohio and the University of Wisconsin.
And I can add to that as well in terms of not having another project is that while we were at High Country News working on this, the budget around this was fairly massive for a nonprofit news organization. So as much as it'd be great to sort of expand in a lot of different directions, one of the most practical areas besides sort of time at the moment is also sort of like funding in terms of being able to sort of like pull those in the same sort of robustness that we've even been able to do here. Even being able to continue the reporting into universities that still have land. We were really lucky to be able to do that. And that story also sort of arrived out of a fluke on some level too, of just sort of, trying to just track down and do our due diligence about remaining acres and whether or not they were still producing any money, and then finding out that mineral acres were associated with it. I think it was Utah that sent back an email to me saying, oh yes, we have mineral acres and surface acres. And we're like, wait a second, hold on. So that was just kind of a lucky catch on some level too. But in practical terms, this project took a very long time, and pulled together sort of an Ocean's 11 team here to pull it off, and it's difficult to do.
All right, we have a question to you, Bobby, whether you can provide any other examples of the history of the United States government using the Landscript system to sell to speculators previously, say in the post World Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, or the post-Civil War with relationship to tribal nations? And if so, who were some of these speculators?
Well, there are a couple of ways to address that question. Probably the largest scrip recipients were military bounties. So you would, after the War of 1812, Revolutionary War, veterans, the War of 1812. This is a system that goes on for a very long time. There are a lot of military bounties that are doled out as scrip. This right to select land with sort of these coupons. And what emerges in the 19th century is a secondary market for scrip, and this is where the speculators come in. You can imagine a veteran returns home from the War of 1812, wants to stay in New York or in Massachusetts. They have a piece of scrip, they sell it to a speculator. They don't necessarily want to go and obtain a piece of land themselves. So this creates a market for large speculators to amass scrip. And this is what happens with the Morrill Act as well. There are some big players in sort of the scrip business in the 1860s. You have to think about this as being a Civil War era law. There is a lot of economic hardship in the mid 1860s. There is opportunities for speculators to sort of scoop up this scrip and to hold it longer term until the prices of land increase. This is what they wind up doing. There's a special case of this actually within the orbit of the administration of the Morrill Act, and that's Cornell University. Lots of these universities that receive scrip sell it off in blocks to speculators. These speculators are they're not connected to the universities, except in Cornell's case, where the scrip was sold primarily to Ezra Cornell, the founder of Cornell University, who was then able to speculate in it and not only allow Cornell to obtain the initial sale price of the scrip, but also to fold back in the profits that he makes through speculating, which really supercharges the returns and enables Cornell to go from a newly founded university in the mid 1860s to the third wealthiest university in the United States by the mid 1880s. It's a remarkable growth that's enabled through this scrip speculation.
Okay, thank you. Here's a long question, so bear with me. Great examples of reforms in research. The question then begins: the reform of land grants have been prioritized by many. For instance, Wendell Berry and other critics have long decried the role of land grant institutions in supporting corporate power, the USDA's non-sustainable practice in research, and the impact of the land use practices. Beyond diversity and land return, how can your research be best used to roll back corporate control of education and to transfer land and resources to regenerative research education and land use in practice, particularly with Indigenous leadership? Do you want me to?
Well, that's a new one for me, but I will. It's a complicated question and topic. I mean, when I am thinking about the power of this story and what Bobby's pulled together, is that it really begins to tug at the very fabric of American mythologies, right? When we actually have to start thinking really critically about what are the sources of land, what are the sort of founding myths that we tell ourselves, and that there is still a matter of justice that needs to be adjudicated in some form in the United States. That, I think, is where the power of this project comes. And I think where we can start having those different conversations about what justice actually looks like. So while the project is really focused narrowly on the Morrill Act and those land grant universities. Again, this information and the methodology can be applied to almost anything that you like. Having those land sessions and being able to take one look at Arizona and say, oh, well, nothing was paid to Arizona or tribes in Arizona because there were no treaties, because everybody was removed or killed after the Apache War. Like, what does this really lead us to start thinking about in terms of like the legitimacy of the state of Arizona or the legitimacy of the United States generally? So the specifics on how you get to those questions about overhauling education, I think are sort of embedded in that larger idea of the legitimacy of the United States and its claims to land, and whether or not there is any sort of movement toward addressing that history and trying to find some sort of justice in it. I mean, when we began this conversation in terms of talking about American democracy and what makes it strong, I mean, if we sit down to actually have, if we were to, for instance, have a vote about whether or not the United States should return land to, tribal nations, my guess is that democracy would say we're not going to do that. So this really adds some questions about like what are the priorities of citizens who benefit from this history, and what those different apparatuses of the state, have in future when it comes to these ideas.
This is a really great question. I think just briefly, what I think our story can help you do is to think about to ask the question of who or what do land grant universities serve? I mean, traditionally, the answer to that question, when Tristan is talking about the myth of land grant universities, has been, well, land grant universities serve the cause of American prosperity. They serve the cause of American economic growth, of technological development, of supremacy on the world, stage. What I think our story helps you ask is say, well, maybe land grant universities should be serving the cause of equity, of reconciliation, of economic justice, of atonement for the violence of American history. And how do we make that happen?
Okay. Is there a pushback from historically Black universities housed on these tribal land grab lands? Have you seen any pushback?
No, I mean, we also did receive no comment back from HBCUs. Bobby and I have just discussed this in the past. I mean, I would love to see more scholarship from folks coming out of those HBCUs, because I think there's a very different conversation that that could be had around this area and this topic. But frankly, nope, we haven't received really pushback at all about this story. I think mostly it's been institutions ignoring it.
Part of the answer there might be too that in the story of the 1862 Morrill Act, this goes to what I was talking about earlier about the ways that we restrict the research project to land. Out of 52 universities, there are 2 HBCUs that received endowments through the sale of this land. Most of the HBCUs that are land grant universities were brought into the program through the 1890 Morrill Act, the second Morrill Act, which had it was also based on land, but had a slightly different funding structure, and fell outside of the bounds of the study that we did here. So it's an area really that, that needs more examination and is a source of, will be the source of further conversations.
I think we have time for one final question, and I'm going to ask you one posed about the issue that's literally close to home. Namely, do you have any thoughts about how the University of California could use their natural reserve system lands for giving back to indigenous nations? They have very large acreage still under their control. Management, as you know, For example, any thoughts about shared management of university and indigenous tribes or other models if the return of land is not going to be possible? So shared management between the university and indigenous tribes if the other models are not going to be possible.
This was an issue that came up after the story was released. Rosalie Fanchel, a graduate student at UC Berkeley, organized a conference around this issue in September and October. And that was one of the issues that came up, thinking about current land holdings of universities, specifically the University of California, and how different styles of or types or forms of partnerships could be developed for stewardship, for resource sharing. And I hadn't, before the conference, one of the great things about having these events is that I hadn't heard about those efforts at all. I mean, I did my degree at the University of California, and I hadn't heard about these possibilities. So just sort of starting this conversation has brought out people who know about the ongoing resource management of universities in other areas that could be thought of, in creative ways for how to think about plans for reconciliation.
I'll just add to that in terms of when we're speaking specifically of land returns. I mean, land returns can always happen. I would argue one of the reasons that they aren't returned or complicated returns is to some degree a lack of imagination. But this can always happen. It's not hard to do. It's just a will.
And the powerful interactive nature of your research materials as you've posted them seems like that's going to advance the unfolding of imaginations, sort of cultural, political, social imaginations. I mean, it's really an amazing space in which to be and learn. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for your presentation today, both Tristan and Bobby. We very much appreciate it. And I'd like to ask our audience to take a minute to fill out the post-webinar survey and to let us know how you heard about the event. And if you'd like to sign up to receive information on future events and also be notified about when this webinar will be available. So again, my thanks and appreciation. And have a wonderful afternoon and weekend, everybody. Thank you
So much.
Thank you.